August 29, 1981, and the Oregon State Fair in Salem was in full swing with thousands of families enjoying the final weekend of summer, the air filled with the sound of carnival rides and the smell of corn dogs and cotton candy. The fairgrounds sprawled across acres of exhibition halls and midway attractions, with livestock barns on one side and amusement rides on the other, connected by wide pathways where crowds moved in constant streams. Mason Fitzgerald was 6 years old that Saturday afternoon, an energetic boy with dark brown hair that fell into his eyes, freckles across his nose, and a gap-toothed smile that his mother said could light up any room. He wore a red and white striped shirt, blue jeans with grass stains on the knees, and sneakers with Velcro straps because he hadn't yet learned to tie laces. And he carried a toy airplane he'd won at a ring toss game. Mason had come to the fair with his parents, Patrick and Linda Fitzgerald, and his older sister, Claire, who was 9, and the family had spent the afternoon exploring exhibits and riding the carousel and eating far too much fair food. At 4:15 p.m., the family stopped at the livestock barn because Mason wanted to see the prize-winning pigs he'd heard announced over the fair's loudspeaker system, and Patrick suggested they all go look together. The barn was crowded with fairgoers admiring animals in pens that lined both sides of a long central walkway, and the smell of hay and livestock filled the warm, enclosed space. Mason walked ahead of his family, excited to see the pigs, and he squeezed between people to get closer to a pen containing enormous Hampshire hogs that were easily 3 times his size. Linda was helping Claire navigate the crowd while Patrick stopped to read an informational placard about sheep breeding, and for approximately 2 minutes, the family was separated by maybe 15 feet in the crowded barn. When Patrick looked up from the placard expecting to see Mason at the pig pen ahead, his son wasn't there, and Patrick's first thought was that Mason had moved to the next pen to see different animals. He walked the length of the barn looking for the red and white striped shirt, checking each pen and asking other fairgoers if they'd seen a small boy with dark hair, and his concern grew with each passing moment. "Linda, where's Mason?" Patrick called across the barn, and Linda's face went pale as she scanned the crowd and realized she couldn't see her son anywhere in the structure. They searched the entire livestock barn twice, checking behind pens and in storage areas and anywhere a 6-year-old might have wandered, and other fairgoers joined the search when they understood a child was missing. Fair security was notified at 4:30 p.m., exactly 15 minutes after the family had entered the livestock barn, and within minutes announcements blared from speakers across the fairgrounds describing Mason and asking everyone to check their immediate areas. "We are looking for a missing child, 6 years old, dark brown hair, wearing a red and white striped shirt and blue jeans. Last seen in the livestock barn. If you see this child, please notify the nearest security officer immediately." The announcement was repeated every 2 minutes while security personnel rushed to all exit gates and began checking people leaving the fairgrounds, and the Oregon State Police were contacted for additional support. In those 15 minutes while the family had been separated in a crowded barn, 6-year-old Mason Fitzgerald had vanished from the Oregon State Fair as if he'd never existed. If this case has grabbed your attention, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the resolution. Hit that like button and comment where you're watching from or what you think happened. Now let's continue. By 5 p.m., over 50 security personnel and state troopers were searching the fairgrounds systematically, checking restrooms and storage areas and under rides and anywhere a child might be hiding or trapped. K-9 units arrived at 5:30 p.m. and were given Mason's scent from a jacket Patrick had retrieved from their car, and the dogs tracked through the livestock barn to the main exit leading to the midway. The trail continued through the crowded midway area, where thousands of people had walked, and the dogs became confused near the parking lot where hundreds of vehicles had come and gone throughout the afternoon. Linda Fitzgerald stood near the livestock barn, unable to move, convinced that if she stayed in one place, Mason would find his way back to her, and she kept calling his name until her voice went hoarse. Patrick searched frantically with security teams, showing Mason's photo from his wallet to every person he encountered, and begging them to look carefully at the children around them. Claire sat with a fair volunteer crying because she felt responsible for not keeping better track of her little brother, though everyone assured her that 6-year-olds were the adults' responsibility, not hers. By 6:00 p.m., the search had expanded beyond the fairgrounds into surrounding neighborhoods and parking areas, with volunteers checking cars and wooded areas, and anywhere a child might have wandered or been taken. Television news crews arrived and began broadcasting Mason's description and photo, and suddenly thousands of Oregonians were aware that a boy had vanished from the state fair in broad daylight. FBI agents arrived from the Portland field office at 7:30 p.m. and immediately began treating Mason's disappearance as a potential abduction, given the circumstances and the amount of time that had passed without finding him. Special Agent Catherine Wells reviewed the timeline with fair security and focused on the critical 15-minute window when the family had been separated in the livestock barn, trying to understand how a child could vanish so completely. The barn has 3 exits, Wells noted: front entrance, side door to the equipment area, and rear exit to the service road where vendors park. We need to know if anyone saw a child leaving through any of those doors. Dozens of fairgoers who'd been in the livestock barn between 4:15 and 4:30 p.m. were interviewed, and several remembered seeing a boy matching Mason's description looking at the pigs, but nobody recalled seeing him leave. One witness named Carol Henderson reported seeing a boy in a striped shirt walking toward the rear exit of the barn with a woman who had her hand on his shoulder, and Carol had assumed it was the child's mother. They walked quickly like they were in a hurry to get somewhere, Carol explained. The boy was carrying a toy airplane and the woman kept her head down. I couldn't see her face clearly because she wore a sun hat with a wide brim. This detail immediately transformed the investigation's focus because it suggested someone had deliberately taken Mason, approaching him in the crowded barn and leading him away while his parents searched nearby. Agent Wells interviewed Carol extensively to create a description of the woman: white female, approximately 35 to 45 years old, brown hair visible under the sun hat, wearing sunglasses, a blue sundress, and sandals. The description was too generic to be immediately useful, matching thousands of women who'd attended the fair that day, but it gave investigators something concrete to pursue and witnesses to search for. Fair security pulled records of vehicle exits between 4:30 and 5 p.m., and over 300 cars had left the grounds during that window, but nobody had recorded license plates or noticed anything suspicious. Several witnesses reported seeing a woman matching the description, getting into a tan or beige station wagon in the vendor parking area around 4:45 p.m., but nobody had seen if she had a child with her. A station wagon makes sense, Wells told her team. Easy to put a child in the back cargo area where they wouldn't be visible, and common enough that nobody would pay attention to it in a parking lot. Oregon State Police issued an alert for all law enforcement to watch for beige or tan station wagons traveling with a single female driver and possibly a young male child, but the description was too vague to be actionable. By Sunday morning, Mason's face was on the front page of every newspaper in Oregon, and his parents appeared on local television pleading for his safe return, with Linda barely able to speak through her tears. Mason has asthma and he needs his inhaler, Linda said to the cameras. He gets scared at night without his nightlight. Please, if you have him, just let him go somewhere safe. We just want our baby home. The mention of Mason's asthma created additional urgency, because without his medication he could have a serious attack, and investigators worried about his health as well as his safety. Tips flooded in from across Oregon and neighboring states, with people reporting sightings of boys matching Mason's description at gas stations and grocery stores and campgrounds, but every lead was investigated and found to be other children. A campground owner near Crater Lake called saying a woman and young boy matching the descriptions had stayed overnight, but when rangers arrived, they found a mother traveling with her own son on vacation. Patrick Fitzgerald hired private investigators to conduct an independent search, unable to trust that law enforcement was doing enough, and the PIs retraced every step of the official investigation without discovering new information. The red and white striped shirt Mason had been wearing became an iconic image that appeared on missing children posters across the Pacific Northwest, and the toy airplane he'd been carrying was described in hopes someone might recognize it. Agent Wells focused investigation efforts on women who'd attended the fair and had histories of child-related issues, prior custody disputes, mental health problems involving children, or previous allegations of attempting to take children. One woman named Barbara Mitchell, who lived in Eugene, raised flags because she'd lost custody of her own son 3 months earlier and had been receiving psychiatric treatment for severe depression and delusional thinking. Mitchell was interviewed extensively, and her home was searched by warrant, but investigators found no evidence connecting her to Mason's disappearance, and she had an alibi placing her at work during the fair. By September, the intensive daily search had been scaled back to weekend volunteer efforts, and the case was transferred to the FBI's Cold Case Unit, where it would be periodically reviewed alongside hundreds of other unsolved child abductions. The Fitzgerald family's life fractured under the weight of grief and guilt. with Patrick blaming himself for reading the placard instead of watching Mason, and Linda unable to forgive herself for helping Claire when she should have been tracking her son. Claire developed severe anxiety and nightmares about the day her brother vanished, and she struggled in school because she couldn't concentrate when every crowded place reminded her of the livestock barn where Mason had disappeared. The Oregon State Fair installed additional security measures the following year, including required registration for all attendees and color-coded wristbands for children, changes directly inspired by Mason's disappearance. The years passed with devastating slowness for the Fitzgerald family, with 1981 becoming 1990 and then 2000, and Mason's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it that morning before they'd gone to the state fair. Linda quit her job as a librarian because she couldn't function normally, spending her days volunteering with missing children organizations and her nights lying awake wondering if Mason was alive somewhere calling for her. Patrick returned to work as an engineer, but threw himself into overtime and projects that kept him away from home, unable to bear the constant reminders of the son he'd failed to protect for 15 crucial minutes. Claire left Oregon at 18 to attend college in California, carrying guilt and trauma that therapy helped manage but never fully resolved, and she rarely spoke about the brother who'd vanished when she was 9. Age progression photos were created every few years, showing what Mason might look like at 10, then 16, then 25, and these images were distributed through National Missing Children databases and featured on milk cartons. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1989, generating hundreds of tips that kept investigators busy for months, but every lead dissolved into dead ends, just like the hundreds before them. Detective James Morrison took over the cold case in 2005 when he joined the Oregon State Police, and he became personally invested in solving the mystery that had haunted the state for over 2 decades. Morrison reviewed every witness statement and piece of evidence, and he became fixated on the woman in the sun hat, who'd been seen leaving the livestock barn with a boy matching Mason's description. The composite sketch had been viewed by millions over the years through television programs and missing children publications, but nobody had ever definitively identified the woman despite her distinctive sun hat and blue sundress. By 2010, Mason would have been 35 years old, possibly with a career and family of his own, and the statistical likelihood that he was still alive seemed impossible, yet was what Linda clung to desperately. Patrick and Linda's marriage survived against all odds, both understanding that separating would mean losing the only other person who remembered Mason as a living child, rather than a missing persons case number. The tan station wagon had never been identified despite extensive searches of vehicle registrations and interviews with hundreds of station wagon owners, and the lead had eventually gone cold like everything else. In 2020, Detective Sarah Chen was assigned to Oregon's cold case unit and began applying modern forensic genealogy techniques to unsolved cases from previous decades, hoping DNA databases might reveal connections. However, Mason's case presented a unique challenge because there had never been any physical evidence collected, no DNA to test, no items left behind that could connect to a suspect or help locate him. Chen approached the case from a different angle, focusing on identifying the woman in the sun hat rather than searching directly for Mason, reasoning that finding the abductor might lead to answers about what had happened. She created a detailed behavioral profile based on witness descriptions and the circumstances of the abduction. A woman comfortable in crowds, experienced with children, bold enough to take a child in broad daylight, and organized enough to plan an escape route. Chen cross-referenced this profile against women who'd been investigated for child-related crimes in Oregon and neighboring states during the 1980s and 1990s, looking for anyone matching the physical description who'd shown patterns of targeting young boys. One case from 1986 caught her attention. A woman named Diane Mercer had been arrested in Medford for attempting to abduct a 7-year-old boy from a grocery store, and witness descriptions mentioned she'd worn a distinctive wide-brimmed sun hat. Chen pulled Mercer's complete criminal and psychiatric history and discovered she'd undergone mental health treatment after losing her own son to drowning in 1979, and she'd developed an obsession with replacing him. Mercer had been 42 at the time of her arrest in 1986, which meant she would have been 37 in 1981, fitting the age range estimated by witnesses at the state fair. Most significantly, Chen discovered that Mercer had attended the Oregon State Fair annually between 1978 and 1985 as a vendor selling handmade crafts, which gave her intimate knowledge of the fairgrounds layout and access to vendor parking areas. This placed Mercer at the exact location with opportunity and a behavioral pattern that matched the abduction profile, and Chen's investigation intensified as she searched for concrete evidence linking Mercer to Mason's disappearance. But Diane Mercer had died in 2018 from cancer, taking whatever knowledge she had about Mason Fitzgerald to her grave, and Chen faced the familiar frustration of being close to answers that a deceased suspect could no longer provide. However, Chen discovered something in Mercer's probate records that changed everything. Mercer had left her estate to an adult son named Ryan Mercer, who was now 49 years old and living in Bend, Oregon. According to legal documents, Ryan had been adopted by Diane in 1982, when he was approximately 7 years old, and the adoption had been processed through a private attorney with minimal documentation, as was common in that era. The timeline struck Chen immediately. A woman loses her biological son in 1979, abducts a 6-year-old from the state fair in 1981, and formally adopts a 7-year-old boy in 1982, claiming he was from a private placement. Detective Chen immediately began investigating Ryan Mercer, pulling his complete background including birth certificates, school records, and any documentation from his 1982 adoption that might reveal his true origins. The adoption records were frustratingly sparse, listing Ryan as born in 1975 to an unnamed mother who'd supposedly relinquished parental rights, but there were no hospital records or original birth certificate to verify this information. Chen discovered that Ryan had grown up in Medford with Diane Mercer, attended local schools, and had lived a relatively normal life despite his mother's documented mental health issues and her 1986 arrest attempt. Ryan had no criminal record, worked as a software engineer in Bend, was married with 2 children, and by all accounts lived a stable, productive life with no indication he knew anything unusual about his origins. Chen contacted Oregon's adoption registry to see if Ryan had ever searched for biological family, and the record showed he'd submitted DNA to Ancestry.com in 2019 out of curiosity about his heritage after his adoptive mother died. This DNA sample was exactly what Chen needed, and she obtained a court order to compare Ryan Mercer's DNA against the Fitzgerald family's genetic profile that had been entered into databases decades earlier. Patrick Fitzgerald had died in 2016 from a stroke, but Linda was still alive at 73, and Claire agreed to provide updated DNA samples to compare against Ryan Mercer's genetic data. The analysis took 3 weeks that felt like an eternity, and when the results came back in November 2023, they showed a 99.97% probability that Ryan Mercer was biologically Mason Fitzgerald. Chen's hands shook as she reviewed the laboratory reports confirming that a 6-year-old boy, who'd vanished from the Oregon State Fair in 1981, had been living in Oregon under a different name for 42 years. The revelation that Mason had been alive all along, raised just 2 hours away from his biological family, working and living in the same state where his parents had spent decades searching for him, was almost too cruel to process. Chen faced the difficult task of contacting Ryan Mercer to inform him that his entire identity had been built on an abduction and illegal adoption, and that the woman who'd raised him as his mother had stolen him from a family. The phone call on November 15, 2023, changed Ryan Mercer's life forever, as Detective Chen carefully explained that he was Mason Fitzgerald, a child who'd been abducted from the state fair when he was 6 years old. "That's impossible," Ryan said, his voice shaking. "I have memories of my childhood with my mom. I remember being 7 and 8 and growing up in Medford. You must have the wrong person." Chen explained gently that childhood memories from before age 6 are often fragmented or lost, and that Ryan's earliest clear memories probably began after he'd already been with Diane Mercer for a year or more. "My mom told me I'd been adopted, that my birth mother couldn't care for me," Ryan continued. "I never questioned it because she loved me and gave me a good life. Are you telling me she kidnapped me?" The DNA evidence was irrefutable, and Chen arranged for Ryan to meet with therapists who specialized in recovered missing persons before approaching the reunion with his biological family that he'd never known existed. Ryan spent weeks processing the revelation, reviewing age progression photos of Mason Fitzgerald and seeing his own face reflected in images created decades ago, and slowly accepting the impossible truth about his origins. Linda Fitzgerald received the call that her son had been found alive in Oregon on November 20, 2023, and she collapsed in her kitchen sobbing with emotions too complex to name after 42 years of not knowing. My Mason is alive, Linda whispered to Claire over the phone. He's been alive this whole time. He's been in Oregon. We passed him on streets and never knew. Our baby is alive. Claire flew to Oregon immediately to be with her mother, and both women struggled with overwhelming joy that Mason was alive mixed with devastating grief for the 42 years stolen from them. The story broke nationally in December 2023 with headlines proclaiming, "Missing boy found after 42 years," and "Oregon cold case solved through DNA," and Ryan Mercer was thrust into media attention he'd never wanted. Ryan agreed to meet his biological family in January 2024, though he insisted on maintaining his identity as Ryan Mercer, rather than reclaiming the name Mason Fitzgerald that belonged to a 6-year-old he couldn't remember being. The meeting was arranged at a neutral location in Portland with therapists present, and Linda Fitzgerald walked into the room seeing a 48-year-old man who looked exactly like the age progression photos, except now he was real and breathing. "I don't remember you," Ryan said gently, "and I'm sorry I can't give you back the son you lost, but I'm willing to know you and build something new if you want that." Linda approached slowly and touched Ryan's face with trembling hands, seeing the freckles that were still faintly visible, and the gap between his front teeth that hadn't changed, and she whispered, "You're alive. That's all that matters." Claire met her brother with complex emotions, seeing a stranger who shared her DNA but with whom she had no shared experiences or memories, and both acknowledged the difficulty of building a sibling relationship from nothing. The months following the revelation were challenging for everyone involved, as Ryan struggled to reconcile his identity as both Mason Fitzgerald and Ryan Mercer, two people who existed simultaneously in his DNA and his lived experience. Therapy helped Ryan process the complex trauma of learning his entire childhood had been built on an abduction, and that the woman he'd loved as his mother had stolen him from another family who'd spent decades grieving. "I can't hate Diane because she's the only mother I remember," Ryan told his therapist. "She raised me, she loved me, she gave me a good life, but I also can't ignore that she committed a terrible crime and stole me from people who loved me first." Linda Fitzgerald worked with her own therapist to navigate the bittersweet reality of having her son returned after 42 years, knowing they could never reclaim the lost time or rebuild the mother-son relationship that should have existed. "I imagined this moment for 42 years, Linda said in an interview. "But in my imagination, Mason was still 6 years old running back to me, and instead, I got a middle-aged man I don't know, and I'm grateful, but I'm also grieving all over again." Ryan's wife Jennifer and their 2 teenage children supported him through the revelation, though his children struggled to understand how their father could have a completely different family they'd never known about. "It's like finding out your dad is secretly a superhero," Ryan's 15-year-old daughter said. "Except instead of cool, it's just sad and confusing. And now we have a grandmother we never met and an aunt we don't know." Claire worked to build a relationship with Ryan despite the awkwardness of being strangers who were technically siblings, and they found common ground discussing their father Patrick, who died without knowing Mason was alive. "Dad never gave up," Claire told Ryan during one of their meetings. "He died still looking for you, still believing you might be out there somewhere, and I wish he could have known you were found." The case brought renewed attention to the inadequate adoption documentation practices of the 1980s, and led to reforms in Oregon's adoption laws requiring more thorough verification of children's origins before placements could be finalized. The legislation, named the Mason-Fitzgerald Act, mandated DNA testing and comprehensive background checks for all private adoptions, and required courts to verify that children weren't listed in missing persons databases before approving adoptions. Detective Chen received national recognition for solving the 42-year-old cold case, and her innovative use of genealogical DNA and adoption records inspired other investigators to revisit old cases with similar circumstances. Ryan chose to maintain the name he'd lived with for 42 years while legally acknowledging his biological identity, becoming Ryan Mason Mercer Fitzgerald, a name that honored both his lived experience and his origins. He established a foundation to help other families searching for missing children, and to support adults who discover they were abducted as children, turning his complex experience into advocacy that might help others. Linda and Ryan developed a careful relationship over the following year, meeting monthly for coffee, and slowly building trust and connection, though both acknowledged it would never replace the mother-son bond they'd been robbed of. "I can't call her mom because Diane was my mom," Ryan explained. "But Linda is family and I care about her and we're creating something new that's ours. and that has value even if it's not what either of us lost. Ryan's adoptive family, the Mercers, faced complicated legacy questions about Diane's actions, and some relatives defended her while others struggled with the revelation that she'd been capable of abducting a child. The Oregon State Fair installed a permanent memorial in the livestock barn where Mason had been taken, a plaque reading, "In memory of the day we lost Mason Fitzgerald, in celebration of the day he was found," and visitors still leave flowers there. On August 29, 2024, exactly 43 years after Mason vanished, Ryan returned to the Oregon State Fair with Linda and Claire, walking through the livestock barn where his life had been irrevocably changed. "I don't remember this place," Ryan said quietly, standing in the spot where Carol Henderson had seen a woman leading a boy toward the rear exit. "But I'm glad I can be here now, reclaiming it from what happened." Linda held Ryan's hand, something she hadn't done since he was 6 years old and they'd walked through crowds together, and she felt both the weight of 42 lost years and the miracle of having him standing beside her alive. The case of Mason Fitzgerald stands as both a triumph of modern forensic science and a tragedy of time that can never be recovered, proving that missing children can be found alive decades later, but highlighting the devastating impact of years stolen. Ryan introduced Linda to her grandchildren properly at a family gathering in September 2024, and Linda held her teenage granddaughter, who had Ryan's same freckles and gap-toothed smile, seeing Mason's features continued in a new generation. Claire and Ryan's children became friends despite the age difference, and the extended Fitzgerald Mercer family worked to create traditions and connections that honored both sides of Ryan's complicated heritage. The reforms inspired by Mason's case have prevented several potential abductions through better documentation requirements, and the increased scrutiny of private adoptions has helped identify other children who were taken from their families decades ago. Linda Fitzgerald continues to build memories with Ryan, understanding that they're creating something new rather than reclaiming something lost, and she's grateful for every moment she gets with the son who came back to her. Ryan speaks publicly about his experience, helping other adults who've discovered they were abducted as children, and he emphasizes that identity is complex, and people can honor multiple truths simultaneously without diminishing either. "I was Mason Fitzgerald for 6 years and Ryan Mercer for 42 years, he says. "Both are real, both matter, and I'm learning to hold space for both truths while building something new with the family I didn't know I had." And in Oregon, where a 6-year-old boy vanished from a state fair in 1981 and was found alive as a 48-year-old man in 2024, Mason's story reminds everyone that hope is worth holding on to even when decades pass. The case proves that advances in DNA technology, determined investigation, and refusal to give up can solve even the coldest cases, and that sometimes families can be reunited even after 42 years of separation. Ryan Mason Mercer Fitzgerald lives in Bend with his family, maintaining relationships with both the Mercers who raised him and the Fitzgeralds who never stopped searching, creating a life that honors all the pieces of his complicated story. And every August 29th, Ryan visits Linda and they spend the day together, transforming the anniversary of tragedy into a celebration of survival, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family that persist even across decades of separation.